Good afternoon, good evening, everyone who joined around the world for our Going Organic webinar series. My name is Dil Tavaraja. I'm a professor at the Clemson University, oversee Organic Pulse Breeding Program. And our program has been doing this organic webinar series for every month. We bring a invited distinguished guest speaker. Our program supported by the USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, NIFA, South Carolina Department of Agriculture, USDA, ARS, and also Global Food Short. I first like to thank all our sponsors that sponsoring and funding our research. With that, I would like to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Susan Whiting. She's the Distinguished Professor of Nutrition, University of Saskatchewan. She has been one of our mentors, advisor for our program. She has been to Clemson University and an active member of our Pulse Quality and Nutrition Breeding Program. Dr. Whiting is a member of the faculty since 1988, completed doctoral training in medicine, renal physiology at the University of British Columbia. And she is a member of Dietitian of Canada, the Canadian Society for Nutritional Sciences, the American Society for Nutrition, and American Public Health Association. She has been involved in many dietary changes, dietary recommendations, and using pulses as a dietary supplement for many associations. And she has been the champion for bringing pulses into our plate. For over 30 years, she has conducted research on diet influences on bone health, specifically effect of the protein, soft drinks, calcium on children's bone growth. She also has investigated the use of nutrient supplements, like I said, acid-base effect on bone, and in many other research areas for past decades. So she has been a great advocate for pulse crops, and I hope a lot of people will understand how nutritious is pulses and her thoughts on how we can slowly incorporate this into our diet. With that, I would like to invite Dr. Whiting to take the floor. Thank you, Dr. Whiting.
Oh, thank you, Dil. That was a lovely introduction. So I'm just going to get my slides here. But it is a pleasure for me to be here and talking about pulses. Let's see. Just go back to my first slide.
There you go.
Doesn't want to do that, but that's okay.
You can go one more up if you want.
Sure.
There you go.
But this just gives my name and the fact that I'm going to be talking about pulses as a food, really less than as the crop, and how we can encourage their use. And I'm going to present what I hope is a balanced talk, and I'm going to cover why we focus on pulses as good protein sources. I want to go into the benefits, health benefits of pulses, and to address whether there are any risks in consuming pulses. Now, this talk follows a really important and interesting talk by Dr. Casey Johnson in September, and he covered the food pulses in the food system. And because he is a medical doctor, he also gave us information on what would be nutrition advice. What I'm going to talk about today is a bit different. It's more of a public health point of view and how we can encourage pulse usage, not on an individual basis, but in the population. And I want to start back in the 80s. I think in terms of myself, but also many in Canada and United States, was just a time when dietary guidance was changing. And it was about preventing chronic diseases that were being increased, things like heart disease, cancer, hypertension. And there was a shift in just talking about foods for nutrients to foods to reduce the risk of these chronic diseases. And people were discovering that there were many more foods that could be eaten and enjoyed. And there was a message of variety, getting foods from variety. So I'm showing the cover of a cookbook that was first published in the 80s. It's actually by a home economist, Alice Jenner. And she was from Saskatchewan, which is where I am currently located. And although we didn't use the word pulses back then, her book is called The Amazing Legume, and she provided what was really necessary, and that is recipes. It's really hard to get people to incorporate new foods in their diet if you don't help them to add those foods. Now, I will say that most of her recipes were really taking traditional American and Canadian foods, stews, it's a very meat-based recipe book, to be honest, but she had pulses added and made it easy for people to start using them. But really, it was just really less than 10 years ago that with the International Year of Pulses being declared, that the term pulses was going to be used more and more rather than talking about legumes. Although I have to say that when I looked up the Year of the Pulses in Wikipedia, just to put it on this slide, the last line shown on this slide is, it's the Year of the Pulses, but everybody knows them more as legumes. So we have to be careful when we're talking to people about using pulses that we use language that they understand. Now, one way to help deliver this message is this schematic from Pulse Canada. And it shows all the different pulse legumes that people might be familiar with. And certainly people are familiar with soybeans, peanuts, fresh peas, and fresh beans. But the group in the middle, the pulses, are the ones that we're focusing on. And the USDA has actually decided to not use pulses, but they talk about dry peas and beans and lentils. And that's fine, as long as people realize that we're really talking about the same thing. Further, the Pulse Canada website provides reasons why we focus on pulses. And that is because they are high in protein, low in fat, and a very good source of fiber. And you can see the composition here of 100 grams of cooked pulses, that they range around 8 grams, which this is less than half a cup. So that's a pretty good amount of protein in that half cup. Small amount of fat. We know fat is important in the diet, but unnecessary fat isn't what people want. And the fiber is something that both Canadians and Americans continue to need in their diet. So we have these foods that provide these important macronutrients. But when we look at what is being consumed, and this graph is taken from a 2021 publication where they looked at NHANES. So, this is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And they plotted in the light gray the total population. There hasn't not been, over this decade, there wasn't much of a shift up or down in pulse use. And on average, the American adult was consuming 2 tablespoons of cooked pulses a day. However, when they took out the 27% that were consuming pulses, they found that their intake was actually much higher at half a cup. And they went on in this paper to describe how their diet was much more nutrient dense than the overall population was. So they were showing that consuming pulses would improve the overall healthfulness of the American diet. So how do we get people to consume pulses, knowing that they provide a lot of these macronutrients as well as micronutrients. And one way is for the government to really actively promote their usage in various dietary guidance documents that they issue. And one of the most visible one is a food guide. Now I'm showing here the Canadian food guide and the American plate. And you can see they're actually similar. They're both a plate. They're both saying consume half of your overall intake as fruits and vegetables. In Canada, we just combine them as one big food group. And you can see over here that fruits and vegetables are shown separately. Both of these plates have whole grains, and they just happen to be in slightly different places, about a quarter of the intake. And both of them have a protein group. Now, the American plate did come out earlier, and it's a lovely graphic. But for our food guide in Canada, the Health Canada chose to photograph typical foods that would appear in these food groups. And so an astute person could see here's some red kidney beans, and there's some nuts and some other foods. It's not totally successful because this little pot of white stuff is actually yogurt, and it's to represent that dairy products are a source of protein. But in general, I think that it's fairly successful. Now, in the Canadian food guide, pulses are only found in our protein group. And by mixing both animal and plant sources of protein, I think it takes a balanced view of where people can get their protein. And the documents that come with the guide do stress that more of our protein could be from plant-based sources. The American guide has pulses in both the vegetable and the protein group. And now this recognizes that pulses are more than just protein. They provide a lot of minerals and vitamins that, and especially something like potassium, that can only be derived from plant sources. So, or mainly derived from plant sources. So it acknowledges that pulses go beyond the protein contribution. So either way, both governments are promoting the use of pulses for the population. Why are we pushing pulses? Well, I'll briefly go over the health benefits of pulses, but I want to show you, I think was quite a contribution to the field in 2019. And Wendy Dahl, who's a professor at the University of Florida, put together this book outlining all the ways in which pulses have benefits in our economy, in our health, and how how they play a role in various diseases as well. And it's it's a small book, but it's very comprehensive in terms of the chapters on each of these topics. And I will be citing these chapters as I go along, as using her as the editor in 2019. So what do we know about the health benefits of pulses? Well, there's many, but the three main ones I want to quickly cover are the fact that they do provide a lot of important nutrients and maintain a nutrient density in the diet. They can be implicated in overweight and obesity management, and they reduce the chronic disease risk in the population. And how do we know this? Well, I'll go through a bit of the evidence, or the nature of the evidence. So in terms of the intake of important nutrients, I've already shown you that pulses are a good source of protein and fiber. I've alluded to the fact that they contain vitamins and minerals, and specifically, they're very good sources of folate, iron, zinc, calcium, and potassium. They also contain a lot of bioactives, isoflavones and flavonols, that play a role in disease risk. They're low in sugar, they're low in fat, they're low in sodium, and they replace excess starch. And that could be from grain products, and they provide more protein, and as I've said, fiber. And how we know this is from the slide where using NHANES data, you can see that those people who consume pulses have these nutrients, and people who don't consume pulses have fewer of them. In terms of overweight and obesity, there is evidence that pulses provide prevention through increased satiety. So they prevent overconsumption of energy. And in obesity treatment, there's some evidence that there's reduction in visceral fat, which is the type of fat that we really want to keep low. And the evidence for this is in human trials where they compare a diet that has pulses with a diet that doesn't have pulses. And some of these are full randomized control diets, and some of them are actually small studies but are accumulating and showing this. And I'll give you an example in a minute. In terms of chronic disease risk, the main large, important chronic diseases that are affecting the health of Canadians and Americans, cardiovascular disease, and pulses provide fiber and low fat that help reduce the risk. Hypertension, pulses provide a favorable lower sodium, higher potassium ratio. For colon cancer, the fiber content of pulses is important. And in type 2 diabetes, pulses help regulate uptake of glucose and can keep glycemic index quite low. And the evidence for this is not only randomized control trials, but also cohort studies where they monitor the health of large groups of people over time. And with both of these kinds of studies, you accumulate all the data into meta-analyses, and you can come up with favorable results. So in the past decade or more, we've seen more and more articles come out providing evidence about the health benefits of pulses, well beyond the Dahl book from 2019. So I'll just briefly go into what is a small but really interesting study on satiety, just to show you the type of data you can get. And in this study, they used 4 different kinds of treatments, but I just want to highlight the 2 where you make a bread that is just 100% white flour, and you make a bread with pea flour that's 20% and 80% white. It's a small change, and in many ways may not affect the color or the taste of the food. People are working on those aspects. But what the researchers did is they took subjects and gave them all the different breads so that they could compare among the same people. And they measured their fullness as well as other factors over time. And the bread that was 100% white flour, the feeling of fullness went away more quickly than it did when those subjects consumed the bread that had 20% pea. So it would show a significant difference that over time, with every use of these foods, you might be able to get a better satiety, less overconsumption of energy-containing foods, and really could help with just controlling people's appetites without them really thinking about it. This is all just happening without in sort of a blind study. So we can change our food composition with things like pea flour and other pulse-derived foods to improve this particular health issue. So we're gaining more and more knowledge about the health benefits of pulses. So the more, what else is there? I just want to touch upon 2 important issues. One is cost, and the other is sustainability. And these are things that people are getting to be much more interested in. In terms of cost, I will confess that my numbers here, I went online and had to figure out what you might be purchasing in the United States, because you might be a little astounded about our cost of foods here in Canada. But I looked at what could be the price for 30 grams of protein from an animal source, such as chicken, And then the fact that a consumer might purchase it in the raw state that they would then have to cook, or they could purchase it already cooked. And basically, cooked foods cost more than raw. Convenience has a price. The similar amount of protein is 30 grams, which is actually a bit more than a person might need in a meal. I chose it in part because a can of chickpeas contains approximately 30 grams of protein as well. If you were to buy the chickpeas dry, that would give you 2 cups of cooked chickpea. You can see that the price is much lower. And if you bought the convenient form, which is a can, it is higher. But overall, given that convenience costs more, pulses can be an economical source of proteins. Now, it took a while for the USDA to actually allow in their thrifty food plan, which initially were food stamps and now I believe is your SNAP program, to allow their budgeting to include pulses, here beans, peas, and lentils, in the canned form. The the costing was always as a dry, which is cheaper. But what wasn't recognized was that people, the recipients of this food cost, were often low-income people who were very busy, and the actual use of dry beans, dry pulses as opposed to can, wasn't always convenient. And the person who was arguing for this change was Adam Junowski. And his papers, especially from the early part of the century, he was writing a lot about what foods cost, which were the foods that provided the most nutrients for the least amount of money, and where we should be focusing some of our nutrition messaging. And here's just an example of one of his papers that says, potatoes and beans provide the most nutrients per penny. And I think that this is still the case today. So we can certainly promote pulses for people to think about as their protein source, because protein is the most expensive part of our food cost. The other side, the sustainability, I just want to point out the EAT report that was in Lancet 5 years ago. They provided information on sustainability of different foods. And here is the listing showing the high oops, I hope that you're not seeing that, greenhouse gases in different foods and that legumes shown here. But I think that they were really looking at pulses because soybean is separately listed as are nuts. These foods, especially plant-based foods, but including pulses, are at the low end, and it's something that high-income countries really need to consider when formulating health promoting information for the population. Oops, now I'm stuck on this slide. A second here. Just going to get out.
You want to hit the escape button and see?
Yeah, there we go. I'll just go to the next slide. See if I can get back in. I hadn't realized I was covering up some of my text here. There we go. So I did say that I was going to cover some information on risks. And I do want to go over a number of molecules that are found in pulses and that are called by the term anti-nutrients. But I want to say that and it's sort of full disclosure that these particular compounds can have detrimental effects. However, a human nutritionist might actually call these benefits. So it kind of depends on where you want to put bioactive molecules of plant origin, because more and more research is suggesting that they are included in our definition of fiber, in particular soluble fibers, and that they show benefits to our microbiome. But the term anti-nutrient was coined by the animal scientists who found, especially in monogastrics, that there were compounds in foods such as pulses and also in grains that could inhibit um, uh, micronutrient absorption, or which could have effects on our GI tract. Now I'm using this. I'll get rid of this. I don't know what to do with this thing. I'm using this article that I found in Nutrients, a review that said, "Is there really such a thing as anti-nutrients?" And so they're arguing, as I could argue, that we maybe should stop using that term and we should look at these molecules in a different light. However, I'm going to approach it that maybe there are risks in consuming pulses. Yeah, having my trouble again here, sorry. Seems to be something about this. Okay,
Might wanna escape again or like
yeah. Okay. Yeah. My Zoom menu keeps popping up on me here. Okay. So the first group of molecules is collectively called FODMAP. These are fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And you can see that I've shown you where the FODMAP name comes from. And if you Google FODMAP, you will come up with a list of foods, such as I'm showing here, where those foods that are high in these fermentable sugars or starches, starch-like compounds, are distinguished by this red color, and saying that if you suffer from irritable bowel syndrome and you have GI symptoms such as diarrhea, but there may be other symptoms that you're experiencing, you may want to look at these foods on the high FODMAP side and see if any of these are associated with your symptoms. And it's really a patient directed kind of exercise. You would have to say, whenever I eat onions, I experience this, but when I don't eat onions, I don't. And on the low FODMAP side are foods that do not contain that many of these FODMAP molecules. And what I've highlighted here are pulses showing up on the high FODMAP side, and pulses being allowed on the low FODMAP size, but with some restriction in amount, and possibly the type, in this case, chickpeas, as opposed to black beans. Now, it doesn't mean that pulses cause IBS. It means that pulses are one of the possible foods that could be causing these irritable bowel symptoms in people. But we have a friend who can't eat onions, for example. So there's quite a variety of foods here. So what does this really mean? Well, one thing that has been uh, shown is that when you process pulses correctly by heating, especially heating them, the oligosaccharides are the fermentability of these molecules is reduced, and that would reduce a person's symptoms. And really, these fermentable oligosaccharides, et cetera, the FODMAPs, are what we call probiotics. And they're being fermented by our microbiome. It's just that in some people, it's causing distressful symptoms, and some way it needs to be controlled. And it's estimated that it could be affecting 10% of adults. That doesn't mean that 10% of adults are experiencing this from pulses. It means that all the FODMAP foods could be causing these symptoms, and pulses are one of many. So people, we do have to be careful not to encourage people who seem to be having bowel problems to eat all the pulses they want. And as the message will be, proper processing and amount of pulses is important. So those are the FODMAPs. The second molecule that seems to be of interest to people are the lectins. And these are found in many seed foods. And this is being promoted on the internet by Dr. Stephen Gundry, who has been giving dietary advice, but he tends to give advice that tells people to stop eating a lot of different foods, not just legumes, but also tomatoes, bell peppers, cucumbers, all foods that are members of the nightshade family, and dairy and grains. So I'm still wondering what we can eat, because one would say, well, maybe fruit is okay, but I just saw him pop up on my internet yesterday complaining about bananas. So he is a bit of a quandary, but he's out there. Basically, there is such a thing as lectin sensitivity. It can affect the GI. However, lectins can be reduced by soaking, boiling, autoclaving, germination, and fermentation of legumes and pulses. And in his he tends to have you watch him describe what's going on, and he covers some of the cases that he has. He is an MD, and he treats people. And one of his compelling cases is a woman who has excess legumes. So she was over consuming them and possibly not properly processing them. The third molecule is phytate, and phytate is actually hexaphosphate inositol. And because of the phosphate groups, phytate tends to bind divalent cations such as zinc. And it is true that in situations of low zinc intake, the ability to absorb zinc is lower when a person is on a high phytate diet than a person on a low phytate diet. So when it's crucial that somebody absorbs zinc, but their diet is high in phytate, then the phytate will prevent it. This is a situation not likely seen in Canada, United States, but it's definitely seen in many countries. And we did a lot of work in Ethiopia where the diet is high in whole grains as well as low in sources of zinc, such as animal products. And it is very important. And some of the work we did was really just in making sure that foods such as pulses were being properly processed, which in that country was primarily soaking. And the fourth group are the polyphenols, and they're actually known more as antioxidants, which we would put on the benefit side, but they also have divalent mineral binding, and they can affect iron. And here's a study where iron deficient women were given different doses, so a fairly small dose of polyphenols versus 10 times the amount. And when you're iron deficient, your ability to absorb iron is fairly good. Now, this is arbitrarily set at 100%, but and the same amount of iron, but now in the presence of polyphenols, reduces iron absorption by half. And that's important when iron deficiency is in the country. And so again, in Ethiopia, iron deficiency is a big concern. And so we want to make sure that polyphenols might be a, a causal factor for that. Now, those of us who drink tea actually know that when you drink black tea and the tannins, which are polyphenol, you can block iron absorption, but you can prevent that blockage by adding milk, which provides calcium and displaces the iron. So there are ways in which this can be overcome. So the bottom line in all these so-called anti-nutrients, because they do have beneficial effects as well, is that processing is important. And processing can be soaking the dry seeds, making sure that cooking is done. Heat is very important for reducing it. And there are more industrial ways in which these compounds can be reduced. And so a simple way, as I showed you with the thrifty food plan, was to say, well, yes, dry pulses are less expensive. However, canning is a way to not only reduce any nutrients, but actually reduce cooking time. So the processing is something that really needs to be considered when we're talking to people about using either canned or dried uh, pulses in their food. So just to summarize, we have low-cost, sustainable plant-based protein sources, and so pulses provide us with these nutrients as well as micronutrients and fiber. The health benefits, as I went through, include reduction in chronic disease risk, which is, of course, very important. And just a caveat that excessive use or of improperly processed pulses or not having adequate processing could cause intestinal problems, and we need to be aware of that. But I just want to close actually on a slightly more positive note, and that is that pulses should be enjoyed. They are incorporated into many different recipes, and I just have two that I've recently made. One, a couscous and chickpea recipe that I've been modifying over time and totally delicious with a sort of a Mideastern flavor. And then here's a soup that I consumed in my trip to Italy last month. So I was very excited to see this as a traditional meal there. So despite my unfortunate uh, technical problems, I hope that people at least have an appreciation of the benefits of pulses.
Absolutely. And that was amazing. And thank you so much, Dr. Whiting. I'm going to start with the discussion with the broader aspect of a question as a breeder and working on the nutrition aspect, especially for organics. Most common question we come in is the flavor. So most Americans, and I'm sure this is for the Canadians as well, canning, they have a problem. So when you can it, you have that bad kind of pungency. They don't like it. And so how do you address this not only for canning, like if they wanted to increase the intake of pulses, we have to address the flavor issue. What kind of approach that we should advise for people?
Well, I think that the first thing is to acknowledge that, and uh, I actually don't detect. I'm a super taster, which means that my bitterness scale, things like olives and black coffee, I can taste. And often I have to train myself. I had to train myself to like blue cheese. Um, so I think more sensory work needs to be done. I think that where some of the issues that I've heard of are in incorporating, like I showed you, adding pea flour to bread without considering whether or not the taste was different. And things need to be done to make sure that um, this doesn't happen. I didn't show one of the issues with pulses, canned pulses, is they're high in sodium, and really a way to alleviate that and possibly some of the flavor is to thoroughly wash. But what I've also discovered though is many people don't want to wash away the whole liquid that the canned pulses come in. That they appreciate the fact that there's extra flavor and an extra starch. So I think that maybe just starting there with washing and not washing canned foods and determining if that's affecting people who aren't used to that slightly beany flavor.
Yeah, I
Where's
also
the
agree with.
umami?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I really like that sending those new kind of recipes, couscous and like in Moroccan style, you could add quinoa and chickpeas as well.
Mhm. Of course, yeah.
So those kind of things might help. But do you have advice for the breeders that how we can incorporate flavor into their pipeline? Um, should we do at the beginning? Or like we do, how before we release, we do the flavor profiling. So do you think that the breeders should consider at the beginning or the end, or depending on the who is their consumers?
Well, I think this is a whole new area. Um, I think that acknowledging flavor differences and seeing through breeding if some of these can be added or taken away. I do think that culturally and uh, socially, we haven't addressed differences enough. There now is a lot of interest in introducing more pulses into children's diets in places where it's not commonly eaten. And school meals might be a start.
Mm-hmm.
At least in Canada, we're just beginning to have a school meal program.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I moved to Saskatchewan in the 1980s and found Alice Jenner's book, as I said, her recipes tended to be, these are the foods you already know, and now we're going to add some pulses to them. Um, uh, but we have a problem in our province. We grow, when you know this, a lot of pulses, and we ship them all over the world. But you go and ask that farm family if they eat them, and they don't. No.
Exactly.
We have to we have to show people how tasty they can be, and not just about the fact that they're high in protein or they're low cost. Taste is very important. Um, and it's a slow process of incorporating foods into restaurant meals and uh, just serving more and more of them. And people go, oh yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, I have another question. This is from one of my grad students. So, we have recently developed a tool to measure, one of my PhD students developed a tool to measure dietary fiber. So he's Amod, and he's asking, what's a good definition for dietary fiber? Does it only originate from polysaccharides?
Oh, um, well, I mean, the basic definition of dietary fiber is um, initially was unabsorbed um, carbohydrate
Right.
uh, from plants, yeah. But and I've been around long enough to remember our early definitions were really about insoluble fiber, and um, they were actually the methodology was really extracting insoluble fiber. And we had for a while in our department very innovative British nutritionist named Alison Stephen, who came along and really told us in the world that fiber was more than that. It was soluble, initially called soluble and insoluble, and they have different sort of benefits. One is transit time and preventing constipation, the insoluble. But the soluble fiber, the whole glycemic index was based on really soluble fiber, um, and it's just really grown. On the other hand, uh, with our beginning to understand the microbiome. So it's almost like stay tuned, because I think there's just more and more being done. So when I said anti-nutrients would be considered a benefit by many gastrointestinal people, it's they're looking at the microbiome and how these molecules affect the growth of different organisms, given the caveat that there are some people who really are very sensitive to these, to overgrowth and to other things going on. So it's getting more and more complex, and another way of saying that, more and more interesting in this whole field. And so I think it's where a lot of people are putting their attention.
Right, exactly. There's questions coming in. One other question from one of the participant, Charlie, asking, are there any concerns with saponin in pulses having an impact on flavor?
That's not something I can really address, but we really, there are some sensory people out there who could help with this. I think it's useful to not just talk about taste and other aspects without attributing it to what's in the what is being consumed.
Right.
So yeah, it's
It does, though. It does
okay.
provide the bitter flavor to the
Mhm.
pulses. Yeah, so we study in our program.
Okay.
There are many different flavors from saponin, and there are different types of saponin, which
Mhm.
gives a bitter to little sort of sweet side. So, but mostly for the bitter. So we just started thinking about it. So
Well, you need people like me that are known super tasters to really help you
exactly.
figure
So
out the bitterness. Yeah.
right. And there's another question. Um, Generally, when we talk about benefits of beans, we talk about dry beans such as kidney or lentils or chickpeas, not talk about mung beans or cowpeas, where these stand on nutritional benefit.
They're similar, really. We tend to talk about the ones that are mostly found in the marketplace. It's interesting with mung beans because when Canada did a survey of pulse consumption, and it was very low. The highest consumption was mung beans, and that was because the Asian communities in Canada were consuming them much more regularly. It's really a bias that using just the terms dried peas, beans, and lentils limits people's understanding that there's lots of different pulses out there. And I think because we're talking generally that they have this similar high protein, high fiber, low fat,
Yeah,
nutritional composition, they really should be similar. And it kind of reminds me of what's going on right now with nuts, which is better, walnut or macadamia or almond. They're all consuming uh, producer groups who are kind of wanting you to think that their product is more nutritious than the other one. But generally speaking, we would say, nuts provide protein and fat and are a good source of those nutrients without distinguishing one from the other. So I like that the term pulses would say, um, yeah, it, the one we don't talk a lot about are faba beans either,
yeah.
broad beans, and they're having their moment as well. So Yeah, I think when you talk about them as pulses rather than as only limiting to those three groups, uh, they should all share. Now, maybe people would feel better if some of these studies were done more broadly on different types of pulses.
Agree. And
Yeah,
it's like you said, it's a little bit of marketing as well. But
yeah.
the other thing is how they grow, right? Cowpeas are more warm season and the mung beans are in between. They're cool season in some parts, and some parts we can grow as the warm season. So that might be effect too. So because peas, chickpeas, lentils, they are cool season. So for us in
Hmm.
South, we use it as a winter crop. So that is kind of interesting discussion. I will take one last question. And this question is about when talking about dry beans and peas as pulses, we also consume succulent beans and peas. I'm thinking this is like vegetables. I don't know, vegetarian? I don't know. It's like the,
Like the fresh
I think
peas.
so. Yeah, I think vegetable peas.
Yeah.
But I was wondering why the succulent beans were not included as pulses. Is it because the nutrient and anti-nutrients are different at a different stage of beans?
Well, I should really get you to answer this, but we're really talking about how we eat those. So when you eat a half a cup of fresh green peas, you're not getting you're getting a lot more water, and you're eating it at a different stage, and you're probably eating a different plant. I mean, it's a pea, but so you're eating something that really resembles more of a vegetable, and so when you go back to that schematic from Pulse Canada, they acknowledge that these are all leguminous foods, but when we're talking about pulses, we're talking about the seeds that um, have been dried and are essentially are more concentrated in
Yeah.
protein. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this reminds me a long time ago when I was in Saskatchewan, did a publication, or North Dakota, one of those. So the phytic acid does not start forming until we harvest it. So we monitor the growth stages and we will not see any phytic acid at the very beginning. So it's like the phosphorus storage once it shut down the whole plant thing.
Mhm.
Yes, different stages of the plant and the different stages of the formation of the seed affect the nutritional quality. Now, US has one of the crop that they like. It's a green chickpeas, garbanzos. We harvest it like a month before actual physiological maturity. So they go as the vegetable peas,
Mhm.
vegetable garbanzos, and they are totally different nutrition quality. Like you said, quite a bit of water, protein less than the maturity. So it's a very good question. Thank you for asking that, because growth stage really do matter. So the short season and the long season. So with that, thank you so much, Dr. Whiting. It is like a pleasure having you and discuss about these current topics, because we have to educate people to understand, and bring in these experts like you, and you're actually doing a wonderful job changing policy. I hope you will come and talk to USAID as well, so we could change policies, people to eat more pulses. So wonderful. Thank you so much. And our next talk is on November 13th at 10 to 10:45. One of my dear colleague, Dr. Eric Boy, he is one of the chief nutritionists from Harvest Plus. I hope you all enjoy the work they have been done for 2 decades, changing the nutrition for Africa, South America, and all about the biofortification. So I hope most of you will join. And thank you so much. And I will see you again in November 13. Have a wonderful evening, good morning, good night. Goodbye.